Let me read to you a passage from the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 11, verse 25 to 30. This passage may serve to suggest thoughts for what the Church calls Indigenous Peoples Sunday, generally on the first Sunday of July. St. Matthew writes, "At that time Jesus said, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and the learned and revealed them to little children. Yes, Father, for this was your good pleasure. All things have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." That's from Matthew chapter 11, verse 25 to 30. It suggests thoughts about the indigenous peoples. What do I mean? Well, within the vast sea of humanity, which is entirely replaced century after century, there are many powerful forces shaping mankind. Among the most powerful is culture. How are we to define the culture of a man or woman or of a society? Broadly, culture is the intellectual and mental character of an individual or society. This is manifested in language, literature, myth, story, ritual, custom, and ways of life. Culture is a very broad concept, but at its core it refers to ways of thought, as this is expressed in myriads of forms. It is plain that if one despises the way a society thinks, one is despising that society and its members. A long-standing culture will have its achievements and its failures, its lights and its shadows, and there can be some shadows which are so bad as to dominate the assessment one must make of the culture. For instance, the ritual sacrifice of human beings was so extensive in Aztec life as to be an immense blot on its record. But the same applies to sophisticated Western culture. There are strengths and most serious weaknesses. But our subject here is the indigenous cultures of the world. The manifest danger is that they will fail to gain the respect and support of the sophisticated and the powerful, with the result that the indigenous will languish and suffer, perhaps greatly. So where do we begin in this matter? We begin by understanding clearly that all, including the least, are our brothers and sisters in the one human family under God. All have an equal dignity before God. We then ought strive to be aware of the strengths and possibilities of indigenous cultures, while having one's eyes wide open to their problematic features. For the average non-indigenous person, a good start is to take some interest in at least one indigenous culture and get to know its strengths. Where? Well, perhaps one would start with one's own backyard, the indigenous culture of one's own country. For instance, if it is Australia, then let it be the culture of the traditional Australian Aborigine. It is often mentioned how grand is the long history of, say, the Hindu culture of India, or the Confucian Chinese culture, prescinding from its recent communist regime, their venerable ages alone being a cause for respect. Missionaries such as Father Matteo Ricci approached them with respect. Well, the Australian Aboriginal culture was immensely long in time, and in certain respects highly sophisticated. By way of illustration, let us touch on this briefly. Father Donald MacKillop, a Jesuit, was the younger brother of Saint Mary MacKillop. In 1882, the Jesuits from South Australia, with priests and brothers directly from Austria, undertook a mission among the Aboriginal people of the Northern Territory. Father Donald MacKillop was 33 when he arrived in Palmerston, that is, Darwin, in 1886, full of energy and zest. He commenced Aboriginal language studies and became acting superior of the mission on occasion, even in his first years. Having been made superior in 1891, he promptly closed all other mission stations and concentrated his personnel resources on a new commencement east side of the Daly River. This is in the Northern Territory. In 1892, he published the following letter, and I quote, "Australia as such does not recognise the right of the black man to live. She marches on truly, but not perhaps the fair maiden we paint her. The blackfellow sees blood on that noble forehead, callous cruelty in her heart. Her heel is of iron, and his helpless countrymen beneath her feet. But we are strong, and the blacks are weak. We have rifles, they but spears. We love British fair play, and having got hold of this continent, we have every square foot. The little Tasmania is our model, and I fear will be until the great papers of Australia will chronicle with regret the death of the last blackfellow." Donald himself had to pull out of the mission in 1896, and by the end of the century, the Jesuit mission there had closed. The Lutheran mission of Hermannsburg, 130 kilometres southwest of Alice Springs, which was much longer and more successful. Donald MacKillop's paper, Anthropological Notes, concerning the tribes of the Daly River, was published by the Royal Society of South Australia. One of the things he commented on was the language of the Aboriginals. He wrote this, "It is a beautiful language, or rather contains the elements of a very perfect one. Take only the question of gender. They distinguish carefully between organic and inorganic nature. Whatever lives will live an animal or a vegetable life. If animal, the gender will be male or female. Then comes the vegetable or lowest form of life. Then inorganic life. A tree living belongs to the third gender. Cut it down, it passes into the fourth. All adjectives capable of the inflection must agree with their nouns in gender, and the verb in the third singular has all the four forms, and likewise must agree in gender with its noun." I'm not here claiming that Father MacKillop was an expert in the language of his chosen Indigenous group. He would not have been there long enough to become so. I quote him only to bring out the tragedy and injustice of despising an indigenous culture. He, a Christian priest, approached his indigenous society with respect and something like a reverential fascination for aspects of its millennia-old culture. He knew that the Redeemer of man wished to invite them to come to him and to learn from him, and that they would find rest for their souls in him. He is the Saviour of the world, and all are called to be his disciples. All indigenous cultures and ways of life will find their completion in Jesus Christ. The challenge for believers in Jesus was and is to show to each culture, including the indigenous, that this is so, and how so. It requires great talent and character, but the love of Christ is what urges it.